In January of this year, the case against 6 Toronto police officers collapsed before the trial could even begin. The 6 drug squad officers were charged with theft, obstruction of justice, and in some cases assault. Why didn't they get their day in court? CBC Radio and CBC News Sunday have combined forces to get to the bottom of this story. Today, you'll find out what was going on behind the scenes from the people who are investigating their fellow officers, from the people who say they experienced police brutality firsthand, and a series of confidential letters and memos outlining the serious problems inside Canada's largest local police force. On a cold winter day in January of 2004, reporters gather outside a courthouse in downtown Toronto. They're waiting for a group of men to do the proverbial perp walk.
This way, guys. You're okay, sir? Excuse us.
These are no ordinary criminal defendants, however. The accused are, or were, veteran Toronto police officers. They were accused of stealing narcotics, of stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from drug dealers and civilians. 2 of the officers were accused of assault.
I really thought they were trying to kill me.
The case was precedent-setting. It was the result of the biggest investigation into police corruption in Canadian history.
The most prolific gang in the city of Toronto is wearing a blue uniform.
But this past January, the whole case was thrown out. The judge, Ian Nordheimer, said the case had taken too long to bring to trial and that their rights had been violated. The Ontario government is appealing the decision, but there's little doubt that this case ended in a shambles and is likely dead. The Crown lost the case not based on the merits of the charges, but because it ran out of time. How did that happen? Who's to blame? A CBC News investigation suggests that the responsibility lies with both the Ontario government and the Toronto Police Service. And what's more, we found new evidence to suggest that the problems inside the Toronto Police Service ran a lot deeper than the charges against these 6 men would imply.
The brass at the Toronto Police Service wanted the allegations and charges to go south. Why? You remember the line from Jack Nicholson? Because you can't handle the truth, okay?
Edward Sapiano is a prominent Toronto criminal lawyer. He was responsible for blowing the whistle on this scandal in the late 90s.
I had been receiving repeated and numerous reports of theft by the drug squad officers in particular.
Sapiano informed the Toronto Police Force that he and other criminal lawyers had numerous clients separately complaining about the same thing, that their money and valuables were being stolen by the very people investigating them. Drug squad officers operating in Toronto's downtown core, mostly out of 53 Division.
There was widespread corruption going on in the Toronto Police Service, and that it involved a large number of officers. I would venture a guess of 30 to 50 officers that were at various times stealing money.
How do you know?
Reports were coming in, by 99, they were coming in every week.
One of the alleged victims was Christopher Quigley. Quigley was a small-time marijuana dealer in Toronto who was arrested by Toronto drug squad officers in 1998.
I was arrested, put in a holding cell, and beaten repeatedly, tortured, for lack of a better word.
Quigley says during the interrogation, they asked him repeatedly, "Where's the money?" And they found a safety deposit box key.
Basically, they gained access to that safety deposit box and absconded with a large sum of money.
Quigley says the police stole $31,000. Meanwhile, his injuries were so severe that he was taken to hospital by ambulance.
The whole situation is indeed quite regrettable.
There were so many accusations pouring in that the Toronto police leadership had to do more than just keep turning the cases over to internal affairs, where they often languished. In 2001, then Toronto Police Chief Julian Fantino struck a special task force. He brought in an outsider to lead it, RCMP Superintendent John Neely.
Highest number of charges relate to obstruction of justice.
Superintendent Neely was assigned 26 Toronto police officers, and they set up shop in this building in a northern Toronto suburb. One of the officers was Jim Castles. In his first television interview, he tells the CBC the task force was facing several problems. For example, Castles accuses the Toronto Police Service's senior leadership of openly undermining the very task force it created.
They just weren't overly cooperative. In some cases, I found them to be obstructive.
For example?
I spoke to a senior officer and tried to coordinate some interviews with civilian clerical staff. And tried to keep it on the QT. Don't want everybody to know what we're doing. Only to find out that what was promised to be kept on the QT, and they were, the senior officer was going to be supportive of our initiative. Everybody in the building knew we were coming and knew why we were coming, and it was anything but a secret.
Did it jeopardize your interview with that particular witness?
Oh, it was absolutely useless.
Still, the task force pressed on with its investigations. Their main target was a crew of officers at Central Field Command 53 Division. That crew was led by Detective Sergeant John Schertzer, nicknamed Boss John. But how John Schertzer even came to be on the drug squad is a bit puzzling, even to his former commander, Keith Ford. Back in 1995, Schertzer was in charge of the Major Crimes Unit at 11 Division in downtown Toronto. But according to a sworn statement given to the task force by Ford, Schertzer had a number of public complaints against him, what he called assaultive conduct. As his unit commander, Ford ordered him back to uniform until they could be investigated. But Schertzer's demotion never happened.
The day that John Schertzer was about to be demoted down to uniform, John Schertzer, according to Keith Ford, walks in and says, "I have friends in high places, and I've been moved and I'm going to the drug squad to head up a team."
Dave Seglins is a CBC radio reporter who has covered this story from the start. He obtained the Ford statement.
Now, Keith Ford shakes his head and he says he called up the deputy chief's office to protest, but he was overruled. John Schertzer was promoted.
In my opinion,
That deputy chief was Bob Molyneux, who's now retired. He told CBC News he did not know of any complaints against Schertzer. However, those public complaints against Schertzer are on the record, and what's more, they didn't stop. There were more allegations of theft and assault against Schertzer during his 4 years on the drug squad.
So how serious was the Toronto Police Force about getting to the bottom of all of this? Well, there are questions about that. For one thing, the force did not assign its most experienced investigators to the case.
I was not the first choice. I was not the second choice. I was probably the third or fourth, more likely the fourth choice.
Now, Castles was an experienced police officer. The problem was he was experienced in tactical emergency response, not criminal investigation. By now, Castles was starting to truly question the force's commitment to dealing with corruption within its ranks. Take the example of Rob Kelly. Kelly was a Toronto drug squad officer who did not, by the way, work with Schertzer's crew. Kelly had become addicted to cocaine. In fact, he would bring his informants cocaine and snort it with them. One of those informants worked as a horse trainer. The informant said Kelly also began betting on fixed horse races at the Woodbine racetrack in northern Toronto. Kelly was investigated by the task force and arrested in 2001. He was charged with drug trafficking. But Detective Kelly then struck a deal with the police. He pled guilty to charges of simple possession of cocaine, and what's more, he was allowed to keep his job.
At the end of the day, people felt that what they had said initially about that type of conduct was that, that they wouldn't stand for that.
The use of cocaine.
Yes.
The fixing of races.
Yeah. And the question of, well, where did the cocaine come from? Never got answered.
Even the prosecutor on the case, John North, was outraged. He wrote in a letter to the police department that he has completely lost faith in the Toronto Police Service's desire to deal with corrupt officers. And he says that, if nothing else, The time I spent on this case has opened my eyes to how the Toronto Police really views serious criminal conduct by its own officers. Kelly has since voluntarily left the police force. But the story doesn't end there. Kelly's informant also told police investigators that 3 other Toronto police officers had also snorted cocaine with him. But those names have been blacked out in this affidavit. What happened to them?
There was no attempt to hold another sting operation, the likes that they did with their colleague, Rob Kelly, to try to catch them. There was no attempt to look at their financial backgrounds. So these 3 officers were never charged with anything. They were never fully investigated, and as we understand it, they have gone on to be promoted within the service.
Why didn't the task force investigate this? Well, it had so many leads on corruption-related allegations within the force that some simply didn't get pursued. For example, there was a second drug squad facing similar allegations in the Central Field Command. Allegations they'd beaten and robbed this man, Milos Markovic. Allegations that they stole over $500,000 in a total of 4 thefts. Those cases were referred back to Internal Affairs along with several others. But that second crew was never fully investigated.
And there was a list. It was a list kept in the office, kind of ironic. It was on one of the whiteboards. And it was kind of like a tally that was kept in the office of cases that were described as going kind of sideways, that nothing had really happened. And so it became a bit of an inside joke.
A joke?
Well, from the standpoint of, in some cases, it was very overt that things weren't being done.
Still, it's clear from what they were able to investigate that the task force believed corruption ran deep. During the time he led the task force, RCMP Superintendent John Neely produced a series of affidavits. Early on, he thought as many as 17 officers were involved.
Whether the task force was deliberately undermined or didn't have the best investigators, they still clearly felt they had a strong case against Detective John Schertzer and his crew. Superintendent Neely would not give us an interview. However, we obtained a copy of his confidential report summarizing the task force's findings, and it contains a number of bombshells.
It's startling for its frankness. He talks about widespread criminal activity, more than simply what the charges that went before the courts are. He identifies 12 people who they brought charges to the Crown, and in the end the Crown didn't think there was reasonable prospect of conviction for all 12.
Much of the report focuses on the work of Detective Sergeant John Schertzer and his drug squad, the main target of their investigation. Superintendent Neely writes that during the late 1990s, some of the drug squad officers of Central Field Command went on a crime spree. He calls Schertzer a criminal, and he says that those who worked with him chose to follow his criminal ways. That was their calling, and that was their choice. Keep in mind, none of these allegations has been proven in court. All told, task force documents say that from 1997 to 1999, Schertzer's crew generated 47 complaints of theft and allegedly stole a total of $610,000.
Are suspected to have occurred.
In his summary, RCMP Superintendent Neely also details the allegations of 2 of the other officers who were charged. One is Detective Ned Mayotis, and the other is Detective Joseph Miched. Both were part of Schertzer's crew. Neely alleges that in 1998 and 1999, a source told them that Detective Mayotis, quote, stole cocaine, heroin, and weapons, and then through the use of middlemen was able to broker those drugs and weapons back to other criminals or dealers, including possibly to bikers.